Napoleon. How one man conquered Europe and lost everything the Imperial Guard had never broken. These were Napoleon's finest soldiers. Veterans who had marched across deserts, mountains, and frozen wastelands. Men who had watched kingdoms collapse beneath the French eagle. But on the evening of June 18, 1815, something impossible was happening. The Guard was retreating. Across the muddy fields of Waterloo, Napoleon's final army was beginning to fall apart. Prussian troops were closing in from the east. British and Allied soldiers were advancing from the ridge ahead. French officers screamed for their men to hold the line. But panic was already spreading. The Guard is retreating. For words moved through the army like poison. Soldiers who had followed Napoleon across Europe threw down their weapons. Units dissolved. The road behind the battlefield filled with abandoned cannons, wounded men, terrified horses, and the remains of a dying empire. Somewhere inside the chaos stood the man who had once made emperors tremble. Napoleon Bonaparte. He had conquered Italy. He had defeated Austria, Russia, and Prussia. He had crowned himself emperor of the French. He had placed his relatives on European thrones and redrawn the map of an entire continent. At the height of his power, tens of millions of people lived under his rule or influence. Now, surrounded by mud and smoke, Napoleon watched everything disappear. His army, his throne, his dynasty, his future. Yet Waterloo was not the moment Napoleon lost everything. The true collapse had begun years earlier, hidden inside his greatest victories. Because every triumph convinced Napoleon that the next victory was inevitable. Every enemy he defeated created another enemy determined to destroy him. And every mile he conquered took him farther from the limits that even he could not escape. This is not simply the story of how Napoleon conquered Europe. It is the story of how a lonely outsider became the most powerful man on the continent, and how his greatest strength slowly became the weapon that destroyed him. Napoleon was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, on the Mediterranean island of Corsica. France had taken control of the island only shortly before his birth. Napoleon was legally French, but culturally, his family remained deeply connected to Corsica and its Italian traditions. His original name was Napoleon Bonaparte. His family belonged to the minor nobility, but they were far from wealthy. His father, Carlo, was a lawyer and political opportunist who learned to survive under the island's new French rulers. His mother, Letizia, was practical, disciplined, and emotionally strong. Napoleon would later command armies of hundreds of thousands. But his first world was a crowded household filled with siblings, financial pressure, and the memory of Corsican resistance. As a boy, he admired Pasquale Paoli, the Corsican leader who had fought for the island's independence. Napoleon did not grow up dreaming of serving France. He grew up surrounded by stories of people who had resisted it. That contradiction would shape him. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to mainland France for his education. He spoke French with a heavy Corsican accent. Other students mocked his pronunciation, his provincial manners, and his limited money. He was smaller than many of the boys around him. He was foreign enough to be noticed, but ambitious enough to remember every insult. Napoleon withdrew into books. He read history, geography, mathematics, the lives of ancient rulers, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, men who had risen through war and forced the world to remember their names. Napoleon was not naturally charming in the way many aristocrats were. He was intense, impatient, often socially uncomfortable, but he possessed an extraordinary ability to concentrate. While other students laughed, gambled, or chased fashionable pleasures, Napoleon studied the mechanics of power. He chose artillery as his military profession. It was a decision that revealed the way his mind worked. Artillery was not built around aristocratic style. It demanded mathematics, timing, logistics, and precision. A cannon did not care whether its officer came from an ancient family. It cared whether he understood distance, terrain, and firepower. Napoleon did. In 1785, at only 16, he became a second lieutenant in the French army. Under the old monarchy, his career might have remained slow and unremarkable. France was still dominated by birth, rank, and privilege. The greatest positions were protected by the aristocracy. A young Corsican officer with little money had limited possibilities. Then the French Revolution began. In 1789, the old order exploded. The monarchy weakened. Aristocratic officers fled the country. Institutions collapsed. France descended into political violence, rebellion, foreign invasion, and civil war. For millions of people, the revolution brought fear and uncertainty. For Napoleon, it created an opening. The world that had placed barriers before him was destroying itself. Talent could now rise faster than birth, but only if talent was accompanied by ruthlessness. Napoleon returned repeatedly to Corsica, hoping to build a political future there. But his relationship with his childhood hero, Pasquale Paoli, collapsed. Paoli distrusted the Bonaparte family. Napoleon had become too closely connected to revolutionary France. The conflict became personal. In 1793, the Bonaparte family fled Corsica. Their home was attacked and looted. Napoleon left the island of his birth as an exile. He would never truly belong there again. But France was about to give him something Corsica never could: an army. His first great opportunity came at the port city of Toulon. Royalist rebels had handed the city and its harbor to British and Allied forces. Revolutionary France needed to retake it. Napoleon, still a young artillery officer, developed a plan. Instead of attacking the city blindly, he focused on the forts controlling the harbor. Capture the correct positions, he argued, and the enemy fleet would be forced to leave. His plan worked. French guns made the harbor impossible to hold. British and Allied forces evacuated. Toulon returned to revolutionary control. Napoleon was only 24. He was promoted to brigadier general. The unknown Corsican officer had suddenly become one of the youngest generals in France. But revolutionary politics could elevate a man one day and destroy him the next. Napoleon had connections to Augustin Robespierre, the younger brother of Maximilien Robespierre. When the Robespierre government fell in 1794, Napoleon was briefly arrested. His career seemed close to ending. He had risen through the revolution. Now the revolution threatened to consume him. But Napoleon survived. And in October 1795, Paris gave him another chance. Royalist forces were preparing to challenge the government. The French capital stood on the edge of another violent uprising. Napoleon was given responsibility for defending the revolutionary authorities. He ordered artillery into position. When the Royalist columns advanced, his cannons fired grapeshot into them. The uprising collapsed. The streets were secured. The government survived. Napoleon had shown Paris what kind of man he was. He could make decisions quickly. He could use overwhelming force. And when the political order was threatened, he would not hesitate. Soon, he received command of the Army of Italy. It was the assignment that would transform him from a promising general into a legend. Before leaving, Napoleon married Josephine de Beauharnais. Josephine was older, socially experienced, and connected to influential circles in Paris. She had survived the revolution, though her first husband had been executed during the Reign of Terror. Napoleon became intensely attached to her. His letters from the campaign revealed desire, jealousy, and emotional dependence. But while Napoleon dreamed of Josephine, he was also preparing to conquer Italy. When he arrived, the French army of Italy was exhausted. Its soldiers lacked shoes, food, equipment, and pay. Many officers doubted their young commander. Napoleon was only 26. Some of his generals were older and more experienced. They expected an ambitious political appointee. Instead, they found a commander who understood exactly what he wanted. Napoleon promised his hungry soldiers more than patriotic speeches. He promised them the wealth of Italy. He moved quickly against the armies of Piedmont and Austria. His enemies possessed greater combined strength, but they were separated. Napoleon attacked before they could fully unite. This became one of the foundations of his warfare. Move faster than the enemy expects. Concentrate force at the decisive point. Defeat one army before the next can arrive. Then turn and destroy the second. In a matter of weeks, Piedmont was forced out of the war. Napoleon pushed into northern Italy. At Lodi, French troops attacked across a bridge under enemy fire. The battle was not his largest victory, but it changed the way Napoleon saw himself. Until then, he had been an ambitious general. After Lodi, he began to believe he might be a man chosen for something greater. Austrian armies repeatedly attempted to break his campaign. Napoleon defeated them at battles including Arcole and Rivoli. His soldiers crossed rivers, climbed mountains, and marched through rain and exhaustion. He placed himself close to danger. He remembered units that performed well. He rewarded courage publicly. He spoke to ordinary soldiers in language they understood. They began to believe he knew them. More importantly, they began to believe he could lead them anywhere. Napoleon also understood the power of information. His military bulletins turned victories into legends. Setbacks were minimized. Successes were magnified. The people of France followed the campaign as if reading an epic unfolding in real time. Napoleon was not merely winning battles. He was building his own mythology. By 1797, Austria had been forced to negotiate. Napoleon returned from Italy as France's most famous general. He had gained money, influence, and the loyalty of an army. The government in Paris needed him, but it also feared him. A victorious general was useful. A victorious general loved by the people was dangerous. Britain remained France's greatest enemy. Napoleon considered an invasion across the English Channel, but British naval power made the plan extremely risky. Instead, he proposed striking at British influence through Egypt. Control Egypt, and France might threaten Britain's connections with India. In 1798, Napoleon sailed across the Mediterranean with an army. He also brought scholars, engineers, artists, and scientists. The expedition was military, but Napoleon wanted it to appear like something greater. A meeting between conquest and enlightenment. Near Cairo, French forces defeated the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids. Napoleon entered Egypt as a conqueror, but his position was far more fragile than it appeared. The British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson found the French ships at Abu Qir Bay. At the Battle of the Nile, Nelson destroyed or captured most of Napoleon's fleet. The French army was trapped in Egypt. Napoleon could win on land, but Britain controlled the sea. It was a warning he would never fully overcome. Napoleon marched into Ottoman Syria. He captured Jaffa after brutal fighting. Prisoners were executed. Disease spread through the French army. At Acre, determined defenders supported by British naval power stopped his advance. Napoleon could not take the city. The man who seemed unstoppable in Italy had reached a wall. The Syrian campaign failed. Napoleon returned to Egypt. Then, after learning that France faced political crisis and military defeats in Europe, he made a remarkable decision. He left. Napoleon abandoned most of his army in Egypt and sailed back to France. The expedition had failed to destroy British power. Yet Napoleon returned as a hero. His propaganda had protected his reputation. France was exhausted by corruption, instability, and war. The government, known as the Directory, had lost public confidence. Many French citizens no longer wanted endless revolutionary chaos. They wanted order. Napoleon offered it. In November 1799, he joined a conspiracy to overthrow the government. The coup of 18 Brumaire was confused, tense, and nearly collapsed. Napoleon entered a legislative chamber expecting obedience. Instead, furious deputies surrounded him. Some shouted that he was an outlaw. For a moment, the future emperor appeared shaken. His brother Lucien helped save the conspiracy. Soldiers cleared the chamber. The Directory was replaced by the consulate. Officially, France remained a republic. In reality, Napoleon had become its most powerful man. He took the title of First Consul. He was only 30 years old. Napoleon had not inherited power. He had used military success, political fear, and public exhaustion to seize it. And once he possessed power, he began rebuilding France around himself. Napoleon was not only a battlefield commander. He was an administrator with enormous energy. He centralized authority. He reorganized taxation. He strengthened financial institutions. He created schools to educate future officials and officers. He reconciled with the Catholic Church through the Concordat while ensuring that the state remained dominant. His most enduring achievement was the Civil Code, later widely known as the Napoleonic Code. It protected property rights and established a more uniform legal system. It strengthened the principle that male citizens should be equal before the law rather than divided by hereditary privilege. In territories influenced by France, Napoleonic rule helped weaken parts of the old feudal order. But his reforms had clear limits. The legal system strengthened the authority of husbands and fathers. Women lost important rights they had gained during parts of the revolution. Napoleon restricted political freedom. Newspapers were closed. Critics were watched. Elections and plebiscites were controlled to strengthen his legitimacy. Police and censorship protected the regime. In 1802, his government restored slavery in French colonies where it had been abolished by the revolution. Napoleon preserved some revolutionary principles, but he destroyed the revolution's experiment with political liberty. He offered equality under centralized authority, careers open to talent, as long as talent served the state, stability, but not democracy, order, but not freedom. Many French citizens accepted the bargain. Years of violence had made peace and security deeply attractive. Napoleon also restored French military power. In 1800, he crossed the Alps and entered Italy. At Marengo, the French army came close to defeat. Then reinforcements arrived. A battle that had nearly ended in disaster became another Napoleon victory. Once again, he controlled the story. Once again, France saw him as the man who could rescue victory from chaos. In 1802, Napoleon became first consul for life. The Republic was becoming a monarchy in everything but name. 2 years later, even the name disappeared. On December 2, 1804, Napoleon entered Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Pope Pius VII had traveled to attend the coronation. The ceremony was filled with religious symbols, imperial clothing, and carefully planned theater. Napoleon took the crown and placed it upon his own head. The message was unmistakable. His authority did not depend entirely on the Pope. It did not come from an ancient royal bloodline. Napoleon believed he had earned the crown through victory. A child of the Corsican minor nobility had become Napoleon I, Emperor of the French. The revolution had executed a king. Now one of its generals had created a new throne. Across Europe, monarchs saw a threat that was larger than France. Napoleon was living proof that an outsider could destroy old dynasties and build his own. Britain, Austria, and Russia formed the third coalition against him. Napoleon had spent months preparing an army near the English Channel. When an invasion of Britain became impossible, he turned that army east. What followed revealed his military system at its most dangerous. The Grande Army moved with extraordinary speed. French corps marched separately, allowing them to travel more efficiently. But they remained close enough to support one another when battle came. Napoleon surrounded an Austrian army at Ulm and forced it to surrender. Vienna fell. Yet Russian and Austrian forces were still in the field. Napoleon needed one decisive battle. He found it near Austerlitz. On December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon faced the armies of the Russian and Austrian emperors. He deliberately appeared vulnerable. His right side seemed weak. The Allies believed they had found their opportunity. They moved forces away from the high ground at the center of their position to attack Napoleon's right. It was exactly what he wanted. Hidden by mist, French troops waited. Then the sun broke through. Napoleon ordered Marshal Soult's corps forward. French soldiers stormed the Pratzen Heights and split the Allied army. What had looked like weakness became a trap. The Allied line collapsed. Austerlitz became Napoleon's masterpiece. An Austrian emperor and a Russian emperor had faced the former Corsican outsider, and he had defeated them both. Austria requested peace. The centuries-old Holy Roman Empire soon came to an end. Napoleon reorganized German territories under French influence. The political map of Europe began changing around his victories. But on the sea, France suffered a disaster. At Trafalgar, Nelson's British fleet destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleet. Britain could not easily defeat Napoleon on the continent. Napoleon could not defeat Britain on the ocean. The struggle between them would push Europe toward years of war. In 1806, Prussia joined another coalition against France. Prussia possessed the reputation of a powerful military state, but its army was living partly on the achievements of an earlier age. Napoleon moved before the Prussians were ready. At Jena and Auerstedt, French forces shattered the Prussian army. Napoleon entered Berlin. Another great European power had collapsed with astonishing speed. Yet Russia continued fighting. At Eylau in 1807, Napoleon faced one of the bloodiest battles of his career. Snow covered the ground. Men disappeared inside blinding storms. Cannon fire tore through packed formations. The battle ended without the kind of clear triumph Napoleon's legend demanded. Thousands lay dead or wounded in the frozen landscape. For the first time, Europe had seen that Napoleon's victories could come at a terrifying cost. Months later, Napoleon defeated the Russians at Friedland. Emperor Alexander I agreed to meet him. The two rulers gathered on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River near Tilsit. Napoleon treated Alexander as an equal. The Russian emperor appeared fascinated by him. The agreements at Tilsit seemed to divide influence across Europe between France and Russia. He expected resistance to collapse once French military power became clear. Instead, Spain exploded. On May 2, 1808, people in Madrid rose against the French occupation. The uprising was suppressed with executions and violence. But rebellion spread across the country. Spanish fighters attacked French troops, messengers, supply lines, and isolated units. They did not always fight in the formal style Napoleon expected. They appeared, attacked, and disappeared. The Spanish word guerrilla, meaning little war, became connected to a new kind of nightmare for the French. Britain sent forces to support Portugal and Spain. Under commanders including Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, British and Allied armies created a permanent front against Napoleon. France could capture cities. It could defeat armies. But it could not force the entire peninsula to accept occupation. The war consumed soldiers, money, and attention. Atrocities and reprisals deepened the hatred. Napoleon later described the conflict in Spain as the wound that helped destroy him. But at the time, he still believed another victory could solve everything. Austria challenged him again in 1809. Near Aspern and Essling, Austrian forces stopped Napoleon as he attempted to cross the Danube. It was a shocking moment. Napoleon had suffered setbacks before, but now Europe saw that his army could be defeated in a major battle. One of his closest commanders, Marshal Jean Lannes, was mortally wounded. Napoleon visited him as he lay dying. The emperor, who often appeared emotionally controlled, wept over his friend. Even victory could no longer protect the people closest to him. Napoleon recovered and defeated Austria at Wagram. But the battle was massive and costly. His system still worked. It simply demanded more blood every time. Napoleon now controlled an empire that appeared almost impossible to challenge. France itself stood at the center. Surrounding it were territories annexed directly, states ruled by his relatives, and governments forced into alliance. His brothers and military commanders received crowns and titles. Kings who had ruled for generations were replaced by members of the Bonaparte family. Roads, laws, administrations, and institutions were reorganized. In some regions, French influence weakened feudal privileges and opened careers to talent. In others, French rule meant taxes, censorship, military occupation, and conscription. Napoleon claimed to carry the principles of the revolution. But many Europeans saw French soldiers taking their food, their sons, and their independence. Resistance grew. So did nationalism. Napoleon had defeated old European kingdoms. But by occupying their lands, he helped awaken new ideas of national identity that would eventually turn against him. At home, Napoleon faced another problem. He had no legitimate son. Josephine had children from her earlier marriage, but she and Napoleon had produced no heir together. For a man creating a dynasty, love had become politically dangerous. In 1809, Napoleon told Josephine that their marriage must end. Their divorce was presented as a sacrifice for France. During the formal separation, both struggled with emotion. Napoleon had conquered capitals without hesitation. But ending his marriage to Josephine wounded him deeply. He married Marie-Louise, the daughter of the Austrian emperor, in 1810. The marriage connected the Bonaparte dynasty to one of Europe's oldest royal families. In 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son. Napoleon named him King of Rome. The outsider now possessed an heir recognized by ancient royalty. He seemed to have achieved everything: power, glory, a dynasty, an empire stretching across much of Europe. But Napoleon had reached the most dangerous point in any rise. The moment when no one around him could easily say no. His ministers might warn him. His generals might express doubt. But Napoleon's past victories stood behind every argument. He had crossed the Alps. He had destroyed armies at Austerlitz and Jena. He had survived Marengo, Ilo, Spain, and Austria. When experience told Napoleon something was impossible, memory answered that he had done the impossible before. Then his alliance with Russia began to collapse. Emperor Alexander increasingly resisted the continental system. The blockade damaged Russian trade. Tensions grew over Poland, territory, economics, and the balance of power. Napoleon believed Russia had to be forced back into obedience. He assembled the largest army he had ever commanded. The Grande Army of 1812 contained French soldiers as well as Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutchmen, and troops from many other parts of Napoleon's empire. Hundreds of thousands of men gathered for the campaign. The scale itself created danger. An army this large required mountains of food, ammunition, horses, carts, and replacement equipment. Roads became crowded. Supply systems broke under pressure. Horses died. Soldiers deserted or fell sick before the most important battles had even begun. In June 1812, Napoleon crossed the Niemen River into the Russian Empire. He expected a decisive campaign. Find the Russian army. Defeat it. Force Alexander to negotiate. It was the strategy that had broken Austria and Prussia. But the Russians refused to give him the battle he wanted. They withdrew deeper into their own territory. Food and supplies were removed or destroyed. Villages were abandoned. The French advanced through heat, dust, rain, hunger, and disease. Every mile made Napoleon's army weaker. Every Russian retreat pulled him farther from safety. Napoleon captured Smolensk after heavy fighting. But the Russian armies escaped destruction. He could have stopped. He could have reorganized. He could have admitted that the campaign was no longer following his plan. Instead, Napoleon continued toward Moscow. He believed Russia could not allow its ancient city to fall without one great battle. This time, he was correct. On September 7, 1812, the armies met at Borodino. It became one of the bloodiest single days of the Napoleonic Wars. French and Russian soldiers attacked defensive positions under relentless artillery fire. Earthworks changed hands. Cavalry charged through smoke. Entire formations were torn apart. Napoleon remained unusually cautious. He refused to commit his imperial guard for the final blow. The French gained control of the battlefield. But the Russian army was not destroyed. It withdrew again. Napoleon had won the ground. He had not won the war. A week later, the French entered Moscow. Napoleon expected Russian officials to meet him. He expected Emperor Alexander to request peace. Instead, Moscow was largely abandoned. Fires spread through the city. Buildings burned. Supplies disappeared. Napoleon occupied the symbolic heart of Russia, but could not force Russia to surrender. He waited for a message from Alexander. None came. Days became weeks. The weather grew colder. Napoleon had captured Moscow. But Moscow had become a trap. In October, he finally ordered the retreat. The army attempted to move through territory already stripped of food. Russian forces followed and attacked. Cossacks struck at isolated groups. Horses collapsed. Cannons and wagons were abandoned. Discipline weakened. Then the winter intensified the catastrophe. Men froze beside the road. Soldiers fought over scraps of food and pieces of shelter. Some marched without proper shoes. Others simply sat down and never rose again. At the Berezina River, Napoleon's engineers built bridges under desperate conditions while Russian forces threatened the retreat. Thousands crossed. Thousands more were killed, captured, drowned, or left behind. The Grande Army that had entered Russia as the greatest military force in Europe emerged as a shattered remnant. The invasion had not failed because of one battle or one snowfall. It failed through distance, disease, hunger, logistical collapse, Russian resistance, strategic miscalculation, and Napoleon's refusal to stop. Russia revealed the truth his victories had hidden. Napoleon could move armies faster than most of his enemies. But he could not control geography. He could defeat soldiers. But he could not force an emperor to negotiate. He could capture a city. But he could not make that city feed his army. And once Europe saw the Grande Army bleeding in the snow, Napoleon's enemies understood that the empire could be broken. Prussia rose against him. Russia continued west. Britain supported the growing coalition. Austria eventually joined them. Napoleon returned to France and built another army with astonishing speed. But the new soldiers were younger and less experienced. Many of the veterans who had carried his victories across Europe were dead. Napoleon could replace numbers. He could not easily replace experience. In 1813, he won new victories in Germany. His tactical ability remained dangerous. But the coalition had learned from years of defeat. Its leaders tried to avoid Napoleon himself when possible. They attacked his marshals. They coordinated larger armies. They refused to accept temporary defeat as the end of the war. In October, the opposing forces met at Leipzig. The Battle of Leipzig became known as the Battle of Nations. Armies from across Europe fought around the city. Napoleon faced overwhelming numbers. For days, The battlefield shook under artillery fire. Then the French position collapsed. During the retreat, a bridge was destroyed too early, trapping thousands of Napoleon's soldiers on the wrong side of the river. The emperor withdrew toward France. The empire he had built in Germany began disappearing behind him. In early 1814, coalition armies invaded France itself. Napoleon fought one of the most brilliant defensive campaigns of his career. He moved rapidly between enemy forces. He won battles with smaller armies. Again and again, he demonstrated the skill that had made him famous. But battlefield brilliance could no longer solve the larger problem. France was exhausted. The coalition possessed more men. Napoleon's enemies could replace their losses. He could not. Allied forces entered Paris. Napoleon's marshals refused to continue a hopeless struggle. In April 1814, Napoleon abdicated. The man who had crowned himself emperor signed away his throne at Fontainebleau. According to accounts from the period, he attempted to take poison. It did not kill him. His enemies allowed him to keep the title of emperor. But his empire was reduced to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. Napoleon left France. Louis XVIII returned, restoring the Bourbon monarchy. Europe's rulers gathered in Vienna to rebuild the continent Napoleon had shattered. It seemed the story was over. But Napoleon had never accepted the role of defeated spectator. From Elba, he followed events in France. He knew the restored monarchy was unpopular with many soldiers and citizens. Veterans feared losing status. Supporters of the revolution distrusted the Bourbons. Napoleon also feared that his enemies might move him to a more distant prison. In February 1815, he escaped from Elba. He landed in southern France with roughly 1,000 men. The government ordered troops to arrest him. Near Grenoble, Napoleon approached a royalist regiment. He stepped forward. He opened his coat. According to the famous story, he challenged them to fire upon their emperor. The soldiers did not shoot. They joined him. Regiment after regiment changed sides. Marshal Ney had promised the king that he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage. Instead, Ney joined his former commander. Louis XVIII fled Paris. Napoleon entered the capital without fighting a major battle. In less than 3 weeks, the exile from Elba had reclaimed France. It was one of the most extraordinary political returns in history. But the rest of Europe would not allow him to remain. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and their allies prepared for war. Napoleon understood that time was against him. He needed to strike before the coalition's armies could fully unite. His strategy resembled the victories of his youth. Move quickly. Separate the enemy armies. Defeat them one at a time. He marched into Belgium. On June 16, 1815, Napoleon defeated the Prussians at Ligny. But the Prussian army escaped destruction. Marshal Grouchy was sent to follow it. Meanwhile, Wellington's army took position near the village of Waterloo. Heavy rain turned the ground into mud. Napoleon delayed his main attack, partly allowing the ground to dry enough for artillery movement. But every passing hour gave the Prussians more time to return. On June 18th, the final battle began. French troops attacked the fortified farmhouse of Hougoumont. What may have been intended as a diversion grew into a brutal battle of its own. Men fought around walls, gates, gardens, and burning buildings. Napoleon launched a major infantry assault against Wellington's line. French columns moved toward the ridge. Allied infantry and British heavy cavalry struck them. The attack failed. Marshal Ney believed the enemy was beginning to retreat. He ordered enormous cavalry attacks. Thousands of French horsemen climbed the muddy slope. Wellington's infantry formed squares. Horses would not charge directly into walls of bayonets. French cavalry surrounded the squares but could not break them. Cannons fired. Men and animals fell. The cavalry attacked again and again. Still, Wellington's line held. Then Prussian forces began arriving on Napoleon's right. Napoleon was now fighting 2 armies. He committed troops to stop the Prussians around Plancenoit. The French captured the central farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte. Wellington's army was under enormous pressure. For a moment, the battle remained undecided. Napoleon had one final weapon, the Imperial Guard. The soldiers marched toward the Allied ridge. These were the men whose reputation had survived every disaster. Their appearance had broken enemy armies before. But this time, the defenders did not break. Allied infantry rose and fired at close range. The Guard's attack lost momentum. Units pulled back. The unimaginable happened. The Imperial Guard retreated. Panic spread through the French army. Wellington ordered a general advance. The Prussians pressed from the east. Napoleon's final army collapsed. The road away from Waterloo became a river of fugitives. Napoleon returned to Paris and abdicated again. He considered escaping to the United States, but British ships blocked his path. Napoleon surrendered to the British, apparently hoping they might treat him with generosity. They had no intention of risking another return. He was sent to Saint Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic. Elba had been close enough for escape. Saint Helena was surrounded by thousands of miles of ocean. This time, Napoleon's prison would hold him. He lived at Longwood House under British supervision. He argued with the island's governor. He dictated memories of his campaigns. He shaped the story of his life for future generations. Even in defeat, Napoleon understood the importance of controlling the narrative. He presented himself as the defender of revolutionary principles, a modern ruler betrayed by kings, a man punished because he had challenged Europe's old order. The reality was more complicated. Napoleon had destroyed feudal structures in parts of Europe. He had promoted advancement based on ability. His legal and administrative reforms outlived his empire. But he had also built an authoritarian regime. He censored opposition. He manipulated political consent. He restored slavery in French colonies. He placed family members on foreign thrones. And his wars brought death and suffering across the continent. Napoleon died on Saint Helena on May 5, 1821. He was 51 years old. The official medical findings identified disease in his stomach, and most historians accept stomach cancer as the likely cause of his death. He was buried on the island. Nearly 2 decades later, his remains were returned to France. Paris received him with ceremony. The defeated emperor became a national legend. His tomb now rests beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides. Napoleon failed to create a permanent European empire. The Bourbon monarchy returned. The territories he controlled escaped French rule. His son never inherited his throne. Yet Napoleon changed Europe in ways his enemies could not reverse. His conquests spread legal and administrative reforms. His occupation awakened resistance and nationalism. His military methods influenced generations of commanders. His rise showed the power of talent and ambition in a world where hereditary privilege had begun to crack. His fall showed the danger of believing that past victories make future defeat impossible. Napoleon was not destroyed because he suddenly lost his intelligence. He was destroyed because intelligence alone could not satisfy his ambition. Every victory expanded the empire. Every expansion created new borders. Every new border required more soldiers. Every new army required more money, more supplies, and more obedience. Spain refused to obey. Russia refused to surrender. Britain refused to make peace. Europe learned to fight together. Napoleon had once succeeded by dividing his enemies. In the end, his conquests united them. He believed Europe could be reorganized through force. But force created resistance. He believed one final victory could repair every mistake. But some mistakes grow larger each time a leader tries to escape them. Napoleon conquered capitals, defeated emperors, and placed a crown upon his own head. But he could never conquer the limits of distance, resources, human loyalty, and time. The boy mocked for his Corsican accent became the master of Europe. The master of Europe became a prisoner on a distant island. And the man who spent his life refusing to accept limits finally discovered the one enemy no army can defeat. Consequence: history remembers Napoleon standing beneath flags, surrounded by generals, with Europe at his feet. But the final image may be more revealing. A former emperor on Saint Helena, looking across an ocean he could not cross, replaying victories that could never bring his empire back. Napoleon won enough battles to believe he could never truly lose. And that belief cost him everything. Was Napoleon's fall caused by unavoidable circumstances? Or did his own ambition make destruction inevitable? Share your answer in the comments. And subscribe for more cinematic stories of the rulers, wars, and decisions that changed history.